Hi there, I'm Eric Wordweaver Sjerven, Goathe of the Ridgar folk here in East Texas, and I'd like to welcome you to The Raven's Call. This is a show where I ramble on about different heathen-related subjects, just kind of whatever strikes my fancy, sets my mind on fire at the time. Big UPG warning at the beginning of this episode, like always. And this is just my views, the views of one heathen here in East Texas. They don't even necessarily reflect the views of the rest of my tribe. Everybody's an individual, and if you watched any of my channel, you know that I am a big proponent for think for yourself. Don't let other people tell you how to heathen. I get sick and tired of that. Not my approach. These are meant to be conversation starters, or maybe to get you to think at something from a different angle and then draw your own conclusions. I'm not in the business of telling people what to think. That's not my gig, whatever. So, all my contact information is down below. You guys know that drill. So please, if you've got something to write in about, please do. I do take show recommendations. The last several have been off of emails and comments and things like that allow for some really cool show ideas. So those are always welcome. I love answering those kind of questions because they get me thinking in directions that I may not have been before. It's like, oh yeah, hey, that's something that I could flesh out and do something on. So I definitely pay attention to those and am more than happy to answer any questions on the air that I'm comfortable answering. There are a few on there that obviously I'm not going to touch on, either for socio-political reasons or just for personal reasons, because if it's too personal I may not want to go into that on the air. You know how it is. It's a thing. So yeah, without any further ado, I guess we can jump into today's subject. I don't expect this one to be as long as the others. I've got stuff going on, so we'll see. Kind of a time limit that I have to hit today, so we'll see. We are rapidly approaching 10,000 views on the Heathenry 101 video, by the way, so that's going to be neat when it does that. I don't think it does anything. It's just kind of cool that it will happen. So, hey, rock on. But today's subject, I was having a conversation with a buddy of mine the other day, actually several friends of mine, and we were talking about Weird and Orlog again, which I know I talk about Weird and Orlog a lot on the channel, but those are it's kind of my wheelhouse. I deal a lot in Weird and Orlog because that's just kind of a very heavy, very key element to my approach to heathenry, and one of the key facets in how heathenry works as a worldview. And as we got to talking, I made the realization that, you guys have heard me on the channel talk about 3 different pillars of heathenry, or any culture in general, that I ascribe heathenry to. There is the religious, which is our interaction with the gods and goddesses. There is our spiritual, which is the interaction with the spirit world, be that the ancestors or the Vatir, anything like that. And then there's the cultural, which is our interaction with each other. One of the things that it dawned on me as we were sitting there having this particular conversation is there's actually kind of a 4th pillar in there. The 4th pillar being philosophy. And that is a key element to a culture because and philosophy can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, but the spiritual side of things encompasses a lot of the magical workings and things like that, dealing with the unseen, the ethereal. The religious is, because heathenry is one of those that, the reason why I refer to it as a worldview, it's a mixture of things. Religion side is very almost codified in a lot of ways. People that say heathenry is not an organized religion, it actually is. There is an organization to it. There is organized ritual. There is a structure for doing your rituals. Now that organization is unique to each tribe and each kindred, whatever you want to call yourselves. There's hearth cult ritual and organization, and then there's tribal ritual and organization. So heathenry is very much actually an organized religion. It's just not a dictated organization. It is an organization that you build organically and you naturally come to. It is not a chaotic thing, it is ordered, which makes sense given the fact that the gods and goddesses, the Aesir and Asynur, are gods and goddesses of order versus chaos. So that tracks. Of course, a religion that worships gods that put the world into order and gave structure to everything would indeed have structure and order to how they do. People rebel sometimes against the terminology for organized religion or anything dealing with structure because they feel like it's being dictated to them. And that's not the case here. You guys have heard me say it on the channel before. Religion's not a dirty word. Religion is a part of heathenry. It is just a term that describes our interactions with the divine, with the sacred. And so when you're dealing with routine interactions with the gods, you build your routines, you build your rituals, you build your organization around how you do this. And that's where the term organized comes from. So an organized religion is simply a religion that has a structure in some kind of way, shape, form, or fashion. We differ from some of the more big book religions because heathenry itself doesn't dictate a structure to everyone. Now, more recon-oriented people will tell you there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. The idea behind this being that they are operating from a standpoint that the ancestors had it figured out, and therefore, based on their system and their organization, this is the way to do it in order to get the effect. And if you deviate from that, well, then you're not going to get the effect. It's kind of a scientific approach to it, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. All they're doing is they're identifying something that they feel works, and then they're sticking to that pattern. People do this all the time with their own organically grown organizations within their own tribes and kindreds. You find out what works for you and you continue to build on that. So there's the religious side of things, which is the more structured. Then there's the ethereal, more meta side of things with the spiritual, where you're dealing more with the magics and the spirits and interactions on those levels. There is, again, to the organizational side of things, the more structured side of things, you've got the culture. And this is more, because the religion's up here, it's an out there kind of thing. Spiritual is an out there kind of thing. Culture is an in here kind of thing. And then we'll get to the philosophy here in a second. So you've got the order of the outer, you've got the more nebulous of the outer, you've got the order of the inner with this cultural structure, be that your tribal structure, kindred structure, whatever that may be, the food that develops within your tribe, your traditions, your way of doing things, your cultural identity, your hearth practices, things like this. Those are cultural nuances that build up over time, and they do have a structure to them. Now, it's a fluid structure, as with anything, but it is still structured. It is a structure that you have created and that you are able to modify as you go along. Nothing wrong with that. And there are some structural elements to dealing with any of these. I mean, to say that like the spiritual dealings has no structure would be erroneous, because you will develop a structure for how you do the spiritual things. It's just the subject matter is a little more nebulous and out there and a little less organized, because there's a lot more fluidity in that, all right? Dealing with the gods and goddesses over time becomes something that's more structured and more rigid as you develop your rituals and how you do things, like your bloat structure, sacrifice, different elements that go into it. Your different magical dealings may become a little bit more nebulous because there's different ways to go about things. There's a little bit more experimentation that goes on there. Meaning sidetrack. So back to the inner side. You've got the cultural side, and then you've got the more nebulous to the inner, which is the philosophy. And this is the way that heathens think about, or anyone thinks about the world. It's logic. It is an exploration of logic. It's an exploration of thought and thought processes. It is, again, the more nebulous of the inner. These things that are not concrete and physical, and not, there's structure to it, but it's more nebulous because it's not something that you can just kind of hammer down. Now, as you get through all of these things, like I explained with dealing with the spiritual and whatnot, there is structure to it all. But with those more nebulous elements, it becomes more fluid in how you think about it and how you deal with it and kind of where you go with it. My dealings with this conversation and realizing about this kind of fourth pillar approach is that the philosophical side of things is where I stick weird and orlog. I have struggled for years with, exactly where does weird and orlog and luck fall in? Because it's not really a spiritual thing, it's not really a divine thing, and it's not really a cultural thing. There's elements to it in the cultural because it's dealing on a personal level. You are dealing with your inner. You're dealing with your weird, your orlog, very personal, and these things are very much about your interactions with the nebulous, the unseen. But it's not dealing with a separate entity. It's not dealing with the gods and goddesses. It's not dealing with the spirits. It's dealing with forces, the laws of reality, if you were, logic, the meta science of things. And that's where I come down to weird and orlog being that key thing, because if you've watched my previous videos on weird and orlog, particularly the one where I discuss weird and orlog with relation to causality, you will realize that studying Weird and Orlog is like studying logic. It's like studying the basic fundamental operating procedures of the world, of all of creation. And it's an essential thing in understanding a worldview for people, because the philosophy, the way they think about things, is iconic and individualized to different cultures. You can look at different cultures throughout the world. You can look at Eastern philosophy with China, Japan, some of the Pacific Islanders and things like that. There's a lot going on there that are unique to their areas, and if you compare the philosophies of those areas to the philosophies of, say, the Greeks or the Romans, or to Britain during their heyday, or currently, if you compare all of these places currently, their individual philosophies are heavily influenced by the philosophies that came before, built upon and creating something new. That causal vector that we talked about with relation to Orlog and Weird, they've inherited the Orlog, and they are continuing to build it through Weird towards Schuld, the future, what it will become, what it can become, what it could become, this nebulous kind of thing. And that's where the more nebulous element of things comes into it. But the discussion of Weird and Orlog falls into that category of philosophy for me, because we're understanding causal relationships. We're understanding kind of the meta science of the world around us. It is this begets that, and there is a causal vector. It is the basis of time in my eyes. What we perceive as time is the progression of Weird into Orlog, and those things that came before is reaching into Orlog, those things, the nebulous things that could be our Schuld, and then the only moment that we are really truly aware of and present in is the now, and that is the Weird. That is where active energy, kinetic energy exists in this moment. Kinetic energy doesn't exist in the past. Future energy is potential energy. So it is potential, it is kinetic here, and it is spent in the past. It becomes inert. So I'm going deep. Sorry guys. I know I'm crazy sometimes, but this is just kind of how my mind works. The essence behind this is that in considering Weird and Orlog, the philosophy of Heathenry, you get to think about it differently. You are not necessarily as codified to praxis as you would be with the religion side of things, and it's got a little bit more logic and sciencey kind of elements to it than saying, say, the magic side of things. Not that there's not scientific approaches to magic, there very much are. I don't want to mislead anybody in that respect. If you talk to somebody that does magical practices, they're very, very organized about how they do things, but there's more fluidity and all that. I've already said it. Anyway, the essence of Weird and Orlog is the study of logic itself, the study of causality, the study of functioning and the way things function, where things function, where they go. Orlog sets a course through Weird into Schuld. It creates that causal vector. You have this point in the past, which is Orlog, and Orlog sets this long course. One of the things that I wanted to talk about with relation to all of this too is that in that same conversation, the individual I was talking to was had a comment about how people want to discuss the fairness of Weird, not even the fairness, but more the equalitarian elements of things. And this goes deeper into some of our discussions on socio-political elements and how Weird and Orlog play into those things with relation to things such as privilege, appropriation, things like that. I'm not having that conversation on here for obvious reasons, but you can kind of see where my wheelhouse was going with all this. And the essence that I find people dealing with Orlog and not feeling necessarily that Weird and Orlog are fair or equalitarian in its application in the world is that they're looking at their lives. They're looking at their existence in this world. And they're like, well, based on Orlog, people that inherit bad Orlog have a harder time of it than people that inherit good Orlog. Those people that inherit good Orlog are privileged and therefore have a better chance in life, and that is not very fair and equalitarian. Here's the thing. Weird and Orlog are not about you and your life. Weird and Orlog are about the entirety of your familial span. It is your Orlog chain. And then in that case it very much is, because it goes back to an equal starting point and the vectors that these have taken throughout existence, the choices made, and the impact that individuals can have upon that particular chain of weird to orlog causality within their own time period, within their own life period. The metaphor that I used for it, because you guys know, or an analogy, you guys know I love my analogies and my metaphors. That's just kind of something that I deal with. It's the poet in me that wants to equate things and put them into picturesque kind of approaches, which is why I DM D&D, because I love doing those kind of things. But anyway, the imagery that I chose on this particular one was an airplane. The airplane, you've got several different airplanes that take off. Each airplane is made up of the same things. Each airplane launches off with the same kind of base elements, the base metals that go into it, fuel, etc., etc. Now, there are different makes and models. That's influenced by the engineers that design them. There's different approaches. Some are built more aerodynamic, some are built more fuel efficient, some are built for long haul, some are built for short haul. And it depends on decisions that were made very, very early on in the design and spec and everything, and then the direction that this thing was sent in. That doesn't mean that it can't be changed or turned into something else. You can retrofit it, and you can outfit it for long distance. You can change the payloads and everything for shorter distances. It can be, there are a number of things that can impact the course of this plane as it goes along. But it is still the summation of every mechanic that's ever worked on it. It is the summation of every pilot that's ever piloted it, every storm that it has ever gone through, every bit of ice on the wings, every ding in the metal, all the stress on the joints. All of these things add up and ultimately impact the overall efficacy of this plane as it goes forward. This is that plane's orlog. When you get on this plane is now your weird. This is your moment. You are in it. This is the now. And then from there, your actions impact the course of this plane while you're on it. You're not necessarily the pilot of it, necessarily. Could be, depends. I would say that the seat of luck for a family or family unit, clan, the matriarch, patriarch, whatever, probably has more pilot influence than, say, somebody who's more tertiary, black sheep kind of thing, who's more on the outside, as far as overall impact on the vector of the plane itself. They can impact it through their own actions and sabotages, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they've got control of the stick and have overall control of the family's vector. It gets deep. Anyway, the gist on this is that you can have some significant effects. If things start to go downhill for this plane and you find yourself in the position to take control of the yoke, you can pull up on it. If it's well designed, if everything's pulled out, you might be able to skirt it and have a soft landing. If everything that has come up before it has been rough and it hasn't been taken care of, and the stress on the joints has just been too much, the plane's been overtaxed by poor weird, creating poor orlog, creating poor luck, then the plane may not be able to stand the stress, and as you pull up and try to pull out of this nosedive, you may rip the wings clean off of it, and it may smash in a fiery heap. That doesn't mean you weren't a good individual. It doesn't mean you didn't do good things. It didn't mean your weird wasn't strong enough. It just simply means that the overall orlog and the vector that this thing was taking was too much for you to be able to pull up. You may have just enough influence to be able to jump in there and pull up on the yoke of the plane and skirt over the top of that mountain before coming down, maybe even coming into a glide for a soft landing where repairs can be made and then the plane can be fixed and it can take off again and find new value and new strength and go forward stronger than it ever has before. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you can pull a U-turn in the middle of the air. You have limitations on the efficacy of the plane, the impact you can have on it. You are limited by what the plane can do, and you work to the best of your ability within that. You can do amazing things from within that, but you can't necessarily take the plane into the stratosphere. You can't necessarily take it into space if it's not built for that. That's going to take significant work and retrofitting and turning it into something that it's presently not. Now, if you happen to inherit orlog where they've already been trying to turn this into an experimental plane that can go into the, into the near orbit or whatever, yeah, okay, then you can probably have enough impact to continue upon that course, or you can tank the whole thing and turn this thing into a boat. You can have some impacts on that. But you're not going to be able to take a 747 and turn it into a space shuttle. That's a multi-generational kind of fix. That's to give you an idea of scope. All right? This whole analogy goes deep and long, and it's crazy. But it is a clear thing. The plane has all of these things that built up to what it is now in this exact moment when you are trying to have an impact on its course. The vector that it's on is set. And it is set by the flight path. It is set by all of the decisions from the pilots leading up to it. Everything before you became in control of this thing influences where it's heading. And then you are limited in what you can do. All right? If a plane is crashing and burning, no, you're not going to be able to pull the thing back up and soar high and long, but you may be able to minimize damage. And that's what I find a lot of people are doing with their orlog in the modern day, is they have inherited some poor orlog, they've gotten some poor luck, and they feel like there's just nothing that they can do because they're trying to think of things on this one lifetime thing. It's like, doesn't matter what I do. Yeah, it does. It totally does, because the actions that you take can prevent more damage from occurring later on. It can prevent a crash and burn scenario and turn it into a skidding slide that maybe people can get off of and still have a go, a rebuild, a relaunch. You know, it doesn't have to be a Titanic situation. It doesn't have to be a Spruce Goose thing, you know, all pretty big and everything, but then doesn't really go anywhere. Doesn't have to be like that, you know. It doesn't have to be a Hindenburg situation. It can be a situation where things look bad, but through the actions of some very strong-willed individuals with very strong weird who are putting very good things into the well, that this can turn into a situation that minimizes damage and saves negative impact from having too much impact on it. I hope you see where I'm going with this. I know I'm an absolute crackpot sometimes, and I try not to get too crackpotty on the channel, but I was really excited by this particular analogy when I was going down it. The page of text was like yay long. It was ridiculous, but I was having fun with it, and I wanted to share it with people because I think other people will take it and run with it and do other things. Not to say Weird and Orlog are an airplane, it's just simply that it makes a good analogy because orlog is set by those that have come before, and the vector that it is established, you're only going to be able to have a certain amount of impact on the vector for orlog. If the orlog for your family has been kind of doing this for a while, good things may be able to pitch it up so it's going like this. Bad things may tank it down where it's going a little bit like this. If it's good and strong, it's been going for a while, and you do poor things, you may hiccup it a bit, but it's nothing that somebody can't come back and fix. So it doesn't necessarily mean if you've got a bad go of it that future generations aren't going to be able to fix some of the things that went wrong. It doesn't mean that if things were going wrong beforehand that, you know, you are destined to go downhill. It means you can have an impact, you can start to pull it up, but don't expect to see huge results in one generation. It can happen. It totally can happen with the right individuals, with everything in the right place. It's like a plane that has stalled out and then suddenly you get an engine restarted. And that's a tremendous difference in a short amount of time that you can pull something out. Doesn't happen all the time. Really awesome when it does happen. And a lot of times people don't even know about it. So, you know, yeah, there are definitely things that can have an immediate strong impact on orlog and weird. But for general purposes, the span of this, you know, I talk about the gods and goddesses being so much bigger than we can comprehend, being so much larger and beyond the scope of mortality, because they are. The bounds of the gods are so far beyond us that I can't even comprehend them, let alone begin to understand or codify. I can't even comprehend it. We do our best to understand them within the scope that we have. And that limited scope also gives us a limited scope when it comes to things like weird and orlog. And we try to think about things within a couple of generations. Well, that's the impact. Weird and orlog of the last couple of generations probably had the largest impact on your here and now. You know, again, with the plane analogy, the most recent mechanic, the most recent refueling, and the most recent pilot probably have a bigger impact than a pilot 20 flights ago, or a pilot or a mechanic 20 flights ago. they do have an impact because they have an impact on the structural integrity of the plane, all of these things, wear and tear, but it's not necessarily that they have as significant an impact as the one that was immediately before you. And that's kind of the way Weird and Orlog go. You have the biggest impact from about 5 generations back, 3 to 5 generations back, depending. And beyond that, it gets a little bit more diluted. As it's been in the well longer, it mixes in more and it's become a little more diluted. Those more recent layers are still stronger. They haven't been diluted as much, so they have a stronger impact on you. A couple of negative generations ago means you're more likely to have hiccups to deal with now than if you had negative stuff 20 generations ago, which has probably been diluted through the well over time. It's not as strong. If there was poison put in the well 100 years ago, you're not as likely to be as impacted as you are poison that was put in there 30 years ago, if that makes any sense, or 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that kind of thing. Time and scope are a big thing when it comes to these things. I've talked about it in a number of different situations before. People think too small when it comes to the gods and goddesses, when it comes to sometimes the spirit world itself. And again, with Weird and Orlog, we're thinking too small. These are huge, long, big picture things. And it's not necessarily there's anything wrong with the fact that we're thinking small. It's just if you're going to truly understand these things, you've got to step back and look at them from a more broad perspective, because that's the scope that you're dealing with. Weird and Orlog do not play out over a single lifetime. They do, but they don't have the fullness of the vector. If you want to see where the Weird and Orlog for a tribe is going, you have to step way back and look at where it's been and where it's heading, because what may feel like a significant downturn because of hardships right now, which would be kind of a spike down on the line graph of your tribe, if you broaden that back out, there's all of this up here before this little tick downwards. And so if your starting point was down here and you've gotten up here and now you've ticked back down here, this feels like a major loss as compared, but taken in the full scope of Orlog, it's really not. You're still ahead. You are still light years beyond where that starting point was. If you look back thousands of years at the course of human development, we are in a different place than we were back then. Judgment values on that aside, as far as how you feel about progress and things like that, the key point is that, for instance, my situation, losing my job and everything here, doesn't mean that I'm having a hugely negative impact on the course of the Sjerven Orlog line. There have been generations that have done fantastic things with this name before me, and in the long run, 100 generations from now, my little blip isn't going to be even felt. It's going to be insignificant in the grand scheme of things, and that makes me feel better about things. That makes me realize that as a whole, we're pushing towards much better things than my little hiccup might influence. It's not as bad as it could be. While it's rough for me now, the generations of the family from now on could have a much better run of it, as long as we continue to push and do better, and we try to do damage control in the here and now. So if I broaden that scope and I take it back and I think about it from more of a full Orlog projection, I realize that a lifetime of good does outweigh a moment of bad. There's this psychological phenomenon that occurs where 2 seconds of bad can outlive a lifetime of good. That's because the good is most often gone unnoticed. While this is a known phenomenon, it doesn't have to be that way. The idea of calling attention to that is to change the framing of the situation, to change where you look at it, and to pay attention to the lifetime of good and weigh that against the 2 seconds of bad, so that it then dilutes that 2 seconds of bad within the rest of the well. Weird and Orlog. 2 seconds of negative weird poured into the well of a lifetime of positive weird that has gone in, mixing in together in Orlog. It becomes diluted, and it's nowhere near as damaging as one might fear it would be in that moment, depending on the scope of it. if it is truly toxic, if it is just an absolute thing, it may poison the well for a generation or two, and dilution may take some time. It's all about scope, it's all about proportionality, but all of that falls into the philosophy of heathenry, the philosophy behind causality, behind time, behind logic, because the logical progression for heathenry is orlog to weird to schuld. It is a progression from orlog through weird to schuld. Weird isn't even, it's a point, but it's Schrodinger's heathenry. It is forever in flux, because this moment, the moment I say this moment, it's no longer this moment. It has become orlog, it has become the past, it has passed into reality. It is the moment of becoming, the now, the literal. If you ever tried to scrub through and edit a video when it's doing this thing as it's going along, by the time you hear what's going on the screen, that line's already gone. All right? It's already become. So trying to keep up with that line is like trying to keep up with the now moment. Live through the fluidity and understand that there are upswings to things, you know? In the grand scheme of weird and orlog, yeah, it's actually very fair and very equitable, because it's just logic, it's just causality. It is the way that things happen. Everything has a causal relationship. Orlog begets your current weird point, and the vector set through schuld decides where this vector for the entire orlog chain is going. That's empowering. It also is a call to keep things in scope and to think about things in a bigger picture. That can be misinterpreted, all right? I am aware of this. This can be misinterpreted to try and devalue individuals in the here and now. I am aware of this. It's a framing situation. You can frame this thing in such a way that it feels like, because of the causal vector, that what we do now is unimportant. That is a fallacy, all right? You do have an impact. It's just, do not become disheartened if the impact on the overall orlog chain is more gradual than you would have liked it to have been. Things don't change overnight. Rome wasn't built in a day. These sayings exist for a reason. It's, in a lot of ways, a lot of the things that we're trying to do for the betterment of our familial lines, for our tribal lines, takes time. And it is not an immediate thing, and that's why each generation is so important. This is why philosophy is important. This is why establishing tradition and establishing culture within your tribe is so important, because from that causal relationship, from that reinforcing nature, you need that continued forward growth, that upward swing, in order for things to continue to prosper. You at least don't want a downward swing. You want, hopefully, a gradual incline, so that it doesn't topple under its own weight. All those things are fantastic. But I get excited by these things. The idea behind all of it, down to the core, is that because of this base causal relationship, and because of the scope of it, things like tradition matter, because it reinforces what came before, and it continues to build it into future generations. If you want the positive things from a previous generation to stick and to make it, then you need to adopt those. You need to actively seek those things out and build on it. If you don't want that, if there are negative things that need to go away, well then extinguish that. And we've talked before about the 3-generational element of adoption through to synthesis into actual culture. There's that point, that generation of creation, the generation of the adoptive generation where they take it in, and there's the first generation that actually is introduced to it, and they have to keep it along, and then by the 3rd generation, things are ingrained. You know, it's a 3-generational kind of push, and the same thing goes for extinction, for a long-standing tradition that's occurred. One generation can abandon it, but a 2nd generation has to keep that abandonment, has to actively not go back to that thing, and then by the 3rd generation, it's been weeded out. Okay, that's how we affect the changes of orlog. That's how you take a family line and make it known for something. It's generations of hard work. It's generations of dedicated thought and applied process, and not just one generation and throwing yourself against the wall and hoping that it sticks. And then if it's not adopted by the next generations, then it doesn't stick around. You can pull up on that stick, but if the next one that gets the stick pushes that nose back down, it's not going to change. Similarly, if you push that nose down and the next generation steps in and goes, all right, well, we're just going to do this, pulls that nose back up, it's okay. So yes, you can have an impact. Yes, very much so. Everything you do matters. Deeds matter. Actions and deeds matter. They have weight. They have impact. They are put in there as orlog. It's not the end of the world if things go wrong. Generationally speaking, it can be dealt with. You can deal with it. If you inherit negative orlog, it's okay. It's all right. It may mean you've got a rough road. It may mean things are kind of tough, but you can affect that. Just don't expect to instantly make it all go away overnight. Expect that it's going to take time, years of dedication in some instances. Just keep scope in mind. If you're trying to fix something that happened a couple of generations ago, then you can have a more immediate effect on it. You can be the one that steps in there and pulls the stick back. Remember that? If you're trying to fix something that happened and set a course for a family 100 or 1,000 years ago, probably going to have less of an impact, and those are going to be kind of things like, family immigrated from Norway to America, in my family's case. I'm not going to significantly impact the course of our global positioning of the family if I move to Japan. That's not going to have that huge an impact. It's not going to suddenly shift the course of the family to be centered around Japan. It's simply going to be a blip, an outlier. The rest of the family is still very much centered here in America. The branch that's here anyway. The one that I have more immediate effect from. And so that's just the kind of thing. Think about scope. Think about those kind of things. If I'm trying to fix, if there had been something that, great uncle had done that had given the family kind of a bad name for a little bit, didn't, luckily, but if it had been, I could have a more strong immediate effect on that because that hasn't diluted and settled into the well as much. It hasn't been cemented into the sediment of the well. It's still fresh enough that I can probably put in some dilution and that will have less of a negative effect in the well because that's still more recent. Scope. So I'm going to let this go because I can ramble on forever on this, but I wanted to kind of call this to attention because one, I just wanted to. I was excited and wanted to ramble and I needed something just to kind of vent it out and let the world see. But two, I thought it might be something that some individuals might need to hear in some respects, or want to build upon in their own ways, or even rebut in some instances. I don't know everything, obviously, but I do love to think and I love to exercise these things, and it gives me a moment to get kind of outside of myself and just get excited, geeky about heathenry. So, Heathen Geeks Unite. Hashtag Heathen Geeks. Hail to you all. Thank you for putting up with my weird ass rants and sticking with the channel. You guys are awesome. Much respect. Thank you. Hail, and may your hearth fires burn bright. Ooh-wee. All right. Let's try to do this. Oof, duh. It went and got hot. It's crazy. Well, it's more humid than anything. Texas springtime, A couple of weeks ago we were under snow. Now we're 80 something degrees and humidity is like 60 something % at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous, but hey, it's Texas for you. It's what we do. So we go from freezing and coats to sweating and rolling the windows down, and go from heater in the morning to AC in the afternoon kind of thing. It's crazy. So yeah, that's Texas. That's what we do. So things are going along pretty well. Working on job front stuff. Like I said, I've been trying to help out here at the shop, but it's coming time where I may have to do a little something, pay some bills, you know what I mean? So I may be looking at a couple of different options, and they will significantly change my day-to-day routine depending on how I do it. Because one of the options, I'd essentially be working 2 jobs, 2 full-time jobs. We'll see. Remains to be seen how that's going to play out, but we shall see. Not much new on the D&D front right now. I'm still, prepping for the next session because scheduling is a nightmare and trying to get everybody together. But we're going to iron some things out, and I think that we'll have something a little more dedicated here coming up. And I'm looking forward to that because I'm itching to get back in the table and roll some dice because I miss it. It's been too long. I don't like doing long in between sessions. I prefer to be in a session every week if I can, but you can't do that as an adult because we've got responsibilities and stuff like that. It's just not fun, is it? But we do what we do. So anyway, onwards and upwards, I suppose. There's not going to be a whole lot in the post-credits today because I've got to clip through this because I've got a phone interview here in a little while for, we'll see, I don't know. I have my reservations about the particular interview that I'm going for this afternoon, so we'll see. I don't know. I'll make my decisions. Anyway, onwards and upwards. Here we go. We are live in 3, 2, 1. Let's jam.